Well, good morning. It's really good to see everyone out. We do have a lot of visitors here this morning, and we're really encouraged by your presence. Thank you for stopping on your travels to worship with us. It's encouragement to us, and we hope that in turn you will be encouraged and edified by our worship to God together. My Bible's open to Luke chapter 16. Go ahead and keep a marker over in Matthew chapter 6. We'll come right back to that, and we're going to be camping out in that text for most of our lesson this morning. But in Luke chapter 16, right after Jesus gives the parable of the dishonest manager, we see a little indication, and right after that parable is given, we get the insight in who's listening into this parable. Who's listening to Jesus' teaching? Because verse 1 of chapter 16 lets us know that he's talking to his disciples, but they weren't the only ones present. Luke chapter 16 and verse 14 says, "The Pharisees who were lovers of money heard all these things, and they ridiculed him." Notice who's listening. The Pharisees. The Pharisees are there, but more importantly, we see that how they're described is being as, well, they were lovers of money. But also their attitude is mentioned as well, that they scoffed at what Jesus is teaching here. They ridiculed him. They were mocking him for what he was teaching about money and how it related to their lives. And I want you to keep that in mind as we're going to be talking about a portion of the Sermon on the Mount this morning. That the listeners of this sermon would have been a Pharisee-rich audience. Pun intended there. And we think about the Pharisees in a lot of different ways. Their toes would have been stepped on. As we read through this entire sermon, if we had the time to read the entire Sermon on the Mount, from their attitude to their worship to their self-righteousness, Jesus steps on their toes. But the section that we're going to be studying this morning in Matthew chapter 6 is going to step on more than the Pharisees' toes. It's going to step on our American toes as well. Maybe more than any other section in the Sermon on the Mount. This gets personal really fast for us in a lot of ways. And so let's be careful when we read and when we talk about this idea of mammon. Let's be careful when reading a section that should humble us and cause us to change and to transform our very lives, that we don't read it saying, well, this doesn't apply to me. This is talking about the Pharisees. As we already pointed out, they were the ones that were lovers of money. Let's not have that attitude. And I think it's important for us to consider, the original audience, those Pharisees, they didn't have closets full of clothes. They didn't have running water. They didn't have dishwashers. They didn't have laundry machines. They didn't have fridges, freezers, stoves, microwaves, iPhones, computers, cars, all these different things that we enjoy today. I think there's a warning in that for us that we may have a hedge already built up around the god of mammon and not even realize it. And I want to get this out of the way now. This isn't on the handout either. So if you want to write down in the little notes section on the handout, or if you take notes, write down 1 Timothy 6 through 10. Because it's the only time I'm going to mention it in this lesson. Everybody always likes, this is the place we start. Anytime we talk about money, anytime we talk about finances. 1 Timothy 6 and verse 10 informs us that the love of money is the root of all sorts, all kinds of evils. As prosperous Americans, we read passages like Matthew 6, and this is the first point we have to make. We have to go and say that it's okay to be rich. It's okay to have money. Because it's the desire, it's the love of money. That's where the sin is. That's where it is wrong. Funny though, I've never met someone, and I'm not saying this sarcastically to make a point. I've never met someone that believes that they love money in an unhealthy way that actually needs to change anything in their life. It's funny how that always applies to someone else. It's always talking about other people. And so before we defend our way of life, before we defend our money or try and clarify or qualify Jesus' teachings, I hope we have a humble heart. That we can open up and think critically about what Jesus is teaching here in Matthew chapter 6. Because I'll tell you what, as a warning, this stepped all over my toes this week. And it's probably going to do the same to yours as well. And so in Matthew chapter 6, I want to break this up a little bit as we talk through it. The first couple of verses here, I'm going to read it again. I think the key word that Jesus is bringing out is this idea of treasure. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And when it comes to your treasures, Jesus is warning us here, hey, don't be storing up treasures that can be destroyed. If your treasure is any type of thing that can be destroyed, that you can lose it, that's subject to corruptibility, that's a pretty poor treasure to have. And so that's not what your value should be. Jesus is teaching us, those treasures, things that can be lost, that's not what our true treasure should be. You think about the age that we live in today, our society as Americans. We go to the extreme to make sure what we have can never be lost. We try to protect what we have, don't we? We do this all the time. If we're worried about our homes, what do? We make sure we have good insurance. We're covered for everything. Ever heard of sinkholes in Florida? When Haley and I were living there, I made sure you have to add that onto your house. I had to make sure last thing I wanted is my home getting swallowed up in a sinkhole. And so we make sure all that's covered. We make sure that's on the insurance. We're worried about theft. What do? We buy security system, top-notch security system. This is on our phone. We get alerts anytime someone comes to the door. We're always safe. We're worried about old age and retirement. So what do? We make sure our IRA is good. The 401k, a retirement plan. We're worried about emergency expenses coming up. So what do? We have an emergency fund. And there's nothing wrong about those things necessarily, not in and of themselves. But here's what oftentimes happens. We feel secure and we start to trust in those things. That's where our true safety, that's where our true security comes from, is in those things, is in that stuff. And is that not where our treasure begins to be? And then things of this earth and things in this life. I want you to think for a second, as we're talking about earthly treasures for a second. What is gold? Have you ever thought about that? What is gold? Some of you may be thinking, PJ, that's a stupid question. Gold is gold. Gold is money. Gold is wealth. It's how we keep score in life. It's how we measure success. Now, I want you to think about it more critically. What is gold? Maybe a better question, where does it come from? It comes from the ground. I don't know about you, but when I see people digging stuff up out of the ground, I call that rocks. You might be saying, well, gold's a little bit different than other rocks. I have a lot in my house. So gold is essentially what we're saying is a shiny rock that comes out of the ground. We have a lot of shiny rocks that are found in the ground. In fact, gold, there's two different types of gold that come out of the ground. One looks like gold, but it's not gold. So we call it fool's gold. And so who determined over time that one shiny rock is more important than another shiny rock? I don't know. I wish some of the shiny rocks in my backyard were that important. But that's just how we've kind of determined things over time. And some of you may be coming from a science background saying, well, actually, PJ, gold has important properties about it. That, when it's purified, when it's defined, it doesn't corrode like other metals. And that's true, but after you've done what? After you've refined it, after you've purified it, you pull gold out of the ground, guess what? Nothing's perfectly pure. Just like any other shiny rock. Or think about it this way. I know a lot of us don't carry cash around with us, so I can't even pull it out. All I have is cards. But if you pull out money, pull out a $10 bill, $20 bill. Anybody have any Benjamins? Pull out a $100 bill. What's that? What's money? I'm not even going to go into the science of it. Really, it's paper. That's all it is. It's a fragile type of paper. And so if it's just paper, what if I trade you my notes for a $100 bill? Would you make that trade? Shane might make that trade. What if the paper's green? Would that make a difference if we traded that? Probably not. I think we understand there's a difference between, my notes and a $100 bill. But is there really, in the grand scheme of things? And so let's get this straight. Somewhere along the way, as a human race, we determined that life is all about shiny rocks and fragile paper. This is what it's all about. Trying to get as much as you can. This is what we pursue. This is what we think life is all about, accumulating. It's the American way. Whoever has the most shiny rocks and the most paper, guess what? They get to be the leader. They're the one that gets to be in charge. Whoever has the most rocks, whoever has the most paper, guess what? They're the one that we let them be the role model for our children. We think that's the person that has life all put together. They have all the answers. They're the one doing it right. Have we ever took a big step back and said, does that make sense? Is that what really life is all about? Collecting these special rocks and special paper? Let me tell you, if our son grows up to be 16 years old, and he says, Mom and Dad, all I want to do in life is collect action figures. That's all I want to do. That is the goal in my life. As a parent, I'm going to be a little bit worried about that. If that's all that he thinks life is about. But you know, when adults do that same thing, they spend all their time going after paper and rocks, we don't even bat an eye. In fact, we go to the other extreme and we think that person has it all figured out. They're doing everything right. That's a mature person. I borrowed that analogy from Jeff Wilson. I heard him do that in a lesson a few years ago about rocks and paper, and that made a huge impact on me as I thought about this section and what Jesus is teaching here. Because in Matthew 6:19 through 21, Jesus tells us what our proper perspective should be. Don't put your value in something that can be lost, something that can be stolen, that can be burned, something that can be taken away. It's hardly a treasure at all. Rather, we should have treasures that go with us beyond the grave, because life is so much more about rocks and paper. Jesus tells us we should be laying up for ourselves treasures in heaven. And this is why it's so important. Notice verse 21 there and what Jesus says. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What we choose for our treasures, that reveals something about ourselves. That reveals something about our character and what we value, what we prize most. And so do you have a heart that is set on this earth? Or do you treasure up things, laying them up in heaven? The application of that is going to be intensely personal. We see it also down in verses 22 through 23, though. Jesus now switches the focus from treasures. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the eye. That the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? You know, this section, whenever I read these verses, especially growing up, it used to always confuse me. It used to confuse me because the way we typically talk about the eye is that it's something that looks outward from the body. But Jesus flips that here. Now he talks about the eye as stuff going into the eye, being absorbed into the body. And that brings out that the eye it brings light to the whole body. I think this ties into something that Jesus mentioned earlier. Remember back in chapter 5? What are we called to be? Salt, but also light. To let our light shine in a way that others see our good works and glorify God. But here's the problem with that. If our eye is unhealthy, we're not going to be able to give off that light. We cannot be light because our body is in darkness. And how great is that darkness? You know, this metaphor by Jesus in verses 22 and 23, when he's talking about the eye, is something that we see all the time in life today. It's talking about cataracts. I know we have some here that have recently had procedures to help with cataracts, and I won't call them out, but I've talked with them about that, and I think I understand that process. They know cataracts are dead cells that affect the lens of the eyes. And as those dead cells increase in your eye, what happens? Well, you get blurred vision. It becomes like a fog or a cloud that you're seeing out of. You can't see the world as clearly as you ought to. And if you don't deal with that, guess what happens? It gets worse and worse to the point that it affects your ability to walk, your ability to do everyday functions. And yeah, you can get by all right, but not the way we're meant to. And Jesus borrows from that idea to make a spiritual point. That just as what enters our eye affects us physically, what enters our eye also affects us spiritually. What we take in, the eye is being used here as the mind of the body. And that's how this connects with laying up treasures. We look at things that we value. We look at things that we treasure. I'm reminded of this every time I go into Best Buy. Because every time I go there, I don't really need anything until I see it. All of a sudden, I see all these fancy things that would be great for the kitchen, great for work, different devices, computers, the TVs. We see all these things. I didn't know I needed it until I saw it. And then what do? I leave the store, I show a little bit of self-control, but then I get online and I look it up and I look at it some more. And then you know how it ends. I talk to Haley about it and I'm reminded I don't need it at all. And then the process typically restarts. But where did that all start? It started with the eyes. It started with what I saw, what I was looking at. And we need to keep our eyes clear. That if my eyes, the way that I filter, the perspective with which I see the world, is always viewed from a materialistic perspective, that I'm going to have a hard time seeing the world as I ought to. In fact, that's going to lead into the next section that we're not going to get into today, but Matthew chapter 6, beginning in verse 25, where he talks about anxiety and worry. No wonder we're so anxious and worried. We're not viewing the world as we should. We're not looking at treasures in heaven. We're looking at treasures on earth. That's where our vision and that's where our eyes are at. So no wonder we're filled with worry. No wonder we're full of anxiety. And so our eyes are the filter of how we view the world. And we need eyes that are clear, that we may have a body full of light. But in Matthew 6:24, Jesus says this, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money, or God and mammon." You probably wouldn't like it if I told you you cannot serve God. You'd probably be offended by that statement. Thinking, who are you to tell me that I can't worship God, that I can't do that I can't serve Him? That's what Jesus is saying here. Do you notice that? If you are serving and devoted and desire mammon, then you cannot serve God. It's not that you should not or you must not. It's that you cannot serve God if your heart and your desires are pulled in a different direction. It doesn't work that way. You can't have two masters over you. Two masters requiring all of you. A slave didn't have two masters, only one. And we can't ride the fence when it comes to serving God and being devoted to Him. And I know, I get it. We piously affirm that we have chosen to serve God and not mammon. I think all of us would agree with that I serve God, not mammon. But what dictates the decisions and the choices that you make on a daily and even weekly basis? Is it God? Or is it maybe mammon? No, we always say things like we want to help the poor, but we can't because we need so much for ourselves. We plan to be more charitable in the future because, well, right now there's just a lot of expenses. There's a lot of bills to pay. We work overtime and do all these different things with our jobs rather than spend time with our children because, well, there's so much that we want to get for them. That's why we're doing it. No, I hear so many people talk about how the greatest dangers that we face in this country is our different ideologies, such as, Marxism, liberalism, communism, humanism, postmodernism, all the other isms out there. These are what we should be worried about as Americans. I think it's simpler than that. As Christians, first and foremost, I think it's materialism that is going to be the death of us. Talking about mammon in particular. We live in such an affluent country, and we love the conveniences that our affluency affords us. And it's easy to allow the god of mammon to be what we serve. But what is mammon? This is what I want to talk about for the rest of our time this morning. What is mammon? Most of the newer translations there in Matthew 6:24 translate the word money, but I like the old King James and even the New King James where it uses the word mammon. It typically refers to that of wealth, money, or even in some instances in Old Testament and New Testament times, it talks about property. But I want you to look at a few verses where this is seen, just to give us a little bit of a reference. Proverbs 3 and verse 9, for instance. It says, "Honor the Lord with your wealth," or some translations say, "Honor the Lord with your mammon, and with the first fruits of all your produce." We're in Luke chapter 16, where we started, looking at in that parable, the dishonest manager. That same word for mammon appears 3 different times. In the ESV, 2 times it appears as the word for wealth. And then in verse 13, it translates it as the word money. And that's basically what we commonly think of when we talk about mammon, right? We're talking about money. We're talking about wealth. But I hope in what I accomplished this morning with the time we have remaining is that you think about mammon in a little bit different way. That this is a loaded term that goes beyond just simply that of money or that simply of wealth. Mammon is actually an Aramaic word. It comes from a Semitic term. You may even have a footnote in your Bible that lets you know that. I mean, that's an exciting thing, right? You know some Aramaic. You may not have even known that. You know some Semitic terms. You know mammon. And this word comes from the same root word, where we also get words like faith and truth from elsewhere in the New Testament. Did you know that? It's the idea of this root word, where we get words like truth and faith. The idea is that behind this root, it's something that's real. It's something that's full of substance. And what is true actually exists. It has an actuality about it. And as a result, what is real, what is substantive, you can put trust into that. You can have faith in what is real. That's the essence of how our faith, how truth, what that's built upon. And so mammon is more than money. At the very core of what this root word is talking about, it's what we trust in. It's what we have faith in. But here's the ironic thing about this word mammon. It originally, when it was first used and first understood, it signified some type of money, some type of possession that you would take to a bank of sorts. That you would entrust this money, you would entrust what you have to another person, and that they would keep it safe for you. And over time, what happens is this word got flipped in how it was used and how it was understood. And then instead of entrusting funds to others, we just began trusting in the money itself. And that's why mammon, oftentimes, if you study this word outside of biblical literature, it appears with a capital M, not a lowercase m. Because many people understood mammon to be a god in and of itself. That's what it represented. We're talking about idolatry when we talk about this idea of mammon. You cannot serve God and mammon. You can't have two gods in your life. And that's the idea of what mammon is. And speaking of ironic, you think about how this comes full circle to us today. What's on our currency, on our money? What does it say? In God we trust. And no, we don't. We don't trust in God. For many people, they trust in that dollar. They trust in their money. They trust in mammon. The very idea of what that word means. That's where you place your trust. That's where your faith is at. And this is where it gets hard for us. This is where it gets personal for us because, let's be honest, who among us doesn't feel a little bit more positively when we see a good bank account? When we pull it up on our phones now, because, we can't wait. We check the app, we see how the checking account's doing, we check, everything's good. We feel a little bit of peace about that. Seeing that retirement investment in good shape, doesn't that make you sleep a little bit easier at night? Knowing that you're financially going to be taken care of? Or when that bonus check hits the account, that makes us feel really good, really excited. We think about all the opportunities that's going to afford us. There's a certain entitlement and freedom that comes with mammon. We enjoy taking all the trips we want, eating wherever we want, giving our kids everything they want, and living vicariously through them as a result. And that's the problem with mammon. On the surface, it looks so good. It looks like something that we can truly place our trust in, truly feel secure, have that safety net. Seems substantive. But the god of mammon is nothing more than a shiny rock. It's nothing more than fragile paper. Mammon is so limited. It talks a big game, but can it really satisfy? Can it really fulfill? No, we live in this society where people are afraid of dying. I think it's one of the greatest fears that we have as Americans, second to that of public speaking. People would rather die than get up and do what I'm doing. I don't get that. But for a lot of people, we are so afraid of death. And as a result, what do? We make the most of this life that we can. Because that's the intent, that's the end of what their God is, the God of mammon. You have to live it up because it's only in this life. It's limited in what it can do. More importantly, what can mammon do about our sin problem? Is there redemption? Is there grace? Is there forgiveness that's found in the God of mammon? Absolutely not. You know, Matthew chapter 6, verse 24 is a verse that really makes Christianity unique. In the Greco-Roman world of first century times, you had this society where men didn't have to choose between gods. They could have as many gods as they wanted. In fact, that was encouraged. Why have one God when you could have two? Why have two gods when you could have up to 500 gods? We read about in Acts chapter 17 when Paul gets to Corinth. And what happens when he gets in that city? His spirit is provoked by all of the idols that he sees. He sees these idols everywhere, and as he begins to address the people, he calls them out that they're spiritual and what they're pursuing, but they're so misguided. They even had an unknown God just to cover all the bases. Make sure every corner of every box is checked in case we missed a God. And yet Jesus says a truth that so few are willing to say. So few are willing to accept. And no other God made an exclusive claim on their life except for Yahweh, Jehovah, the God of Israel. That God accepts no rival. And that's how Mammon is pictured in Matthew 6:19 through 24. Mammon is something that rivals God. It competes for your heart. It competes for your attention. It competes for your devotion. And Jesus says you can't have it both ways. Who are you going to serve? You cannot serve God and Mammon. And you know, typically for a lesson like this, I would close with some application points, but I'm going to let Jesus do that for me because he does an amazing job. And I'm just going to remind us of stuff that we have already said. And for those filling out the handout, I'll go ahead and put these up so you have time to maybe fill in some blanks. Just remember what Jesus has said. In verse 19, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Don't qualify his statements. He says, do not do this, and he means it. But then in verse 20, the solution is, hey, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And as we finish this lesson talking about this idea of mammon, you cannot serve God and mammon. Mammon looks good on the surface. It's the thing that we look at with our eyes. It looks to offer true security, true peace for us in our lives. Like this, if I only had just a little bit more, that this would truly satisfy, that this would give me some type of happiness, some type of joy. But understand, mammon is an idol that we falsely turn to for false security, for false hope. It is nothing when compared to the power of the true and living God. And here's the truth of the matter, brethren. If we had all the money in this world, it still wouldn't solve the greatest problems that we have. It wouldn't. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verses 18 and 19 says this, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. No amount of shiny rocks and fragile paper is going to solve our spiritual problems. There's no amount of money that we can give to God in exchange for our sin. It doesn't work like that. We aren't bought from our sins because of money or gold that we have. We're cleansed through the blood of Jesus Christ. And that happens in the waters of baptism when we are buried with Christ and raised to walk in newness of life. And so if you are here this morning and you are not yet a child of God, maybe you've been reading in your Bible, you've come to understand about who Jesus is and the hope, the forgiveness that is found in him. I encourage you to act on your faith and what you know, that Jesus is the one that is able to cleanse us of our sins. And so if you're here and subject to heaven's invitation anyway, I invite you to come to the front as we stand, sing the song, Select.